Today was the final round of the Tata Steel Chess Tournament. Today we would know who becomes the winner of the Tata Steel Chess Tournament 2023. Nordirback Abdusattorov is on 8 points out of 12, and right behind him is Giri with 7.5 out of 12. And after that, there's Magnus Carlsen with 7 out of 12. So many games are really important today. Anything can happen. Let's take a look how the games went. The first game we're going to take a look at is the game between Giri and Rapport. Anish is half a point behind Nordirback Abdusattorov, the leader of the tournament, and with a win, he's not guaranteed to be first place just yet, because if Nordirback wins the tournament. So there's a lot at stake in this round. Let's find out how Anish played here. So the game started with e4, c5, knight of3, d6 is the Sicilian, and from this variation you can jump to many lines, the knight or the dragon. Let's see which line they chose for. d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6. This is the classical variation, and after bishop g5 we are entering a rouser. g6. This move is quite unusual, played by Rapport. Typically, one of the main moves is to play e6, but g6 is quite unusual. Bishop takes f6, e takes, bishop b5. Now, when you look at this position, obviously you see this pawn structure being absolutely damaged, and it does feel very uncomfortable here. But of course, later in the game, this bishop can become really strong. If black gets to play bishop g7, f5, there could be some ideas here for this bishop across this diagonal. Bishop d7 was played. Here Anish went back, and there was some trade of knights, castles, and now we are in this position, and you can see that black has a pair of bishops, which is giving black a slight advantage, but they do have to give up a lot for that. First of all, the pawn structure is absolutely destroyed, as I already mentioned, and white has a lot more space, it feels like. But on the long run, black could definitely have chances here. Rook c8, knight d5, knight is taking over the center, rook e8, c3 was played, just to be sure, you know, when there's a bishop on g7, having a pawn chain on the diagonal, that bishop, is ideal for white. Bishop d7 was played, bishop b5, and here they repeated the moves a few times, not threefold repetition though, so Anish obviously wanted to go for a win here. He declines the repetition with rook fe1, f5 was played after this, and you see the bishop is opening up now, but still not so ideal. Bishop b3, takes. At least there is one problem solved in black's position. There are no doubled pawns anymore on the f-file, but the pawn d6 remains a weakness. Bishop f5 was played. It looks like white is losing material here because the queen and rook are on the same diagonal. However, there's a check, an intermediate move. Queen takes e8, queen d2, bishop e6. And here they're just trying to improve their position as much as possible. b5, black is pressing on the queen side. Rook c5 comes in, attacking the knight on d5, but white doesn't really have to focus much on it. Knight e3, bishop e5, queen e4, king g7, and slowly but surely white is trying to improve the position and is controlling the majority of the squares. Of course, the bishops seem pretty strong over here, but as you can probably already see, this bishop isn't actually doing much here. What can black possibly do after the move f4, for example? The bishop will have to retreat, and black still needs to figure out how to defend the pawn d6 somehow. So indeed, f4 was played, bishop f6, g4, and Anish is going for it on the king side. He is extremely ambitious, and I mean, it makes perfect sense. He does have great potential on the king side, and those bishops are actually not that strong at all. h6 was played to, of course, stop any sort of g5. Bishop d5 was played because Anish is realizing here that once the light squared bishops are being traded off, which actually happened in the game, you see that there's a strong knight versus a bad bishop. This bishop does not have any squares available. The best you can do is bishop h4, but what is the bishop even doing there? Nothing. So for that reason, this position is already looking very good for Anish, but he still needs to find a way to gain an advantage. Rook c4, queen f3, because of course black still has some moves that are pretty annoying for white to deal with. Queen e6, and here comes Anish with the move f5. Richard takes here, g takes f5, knight f4, queen e5, knight h5. The knight is being maneuvered around because now, because of the fact that the pawn on g6 is gone, you can now put your knight on h5, which is pretty annoying for this king over here. And as it turns out, Anish set up a trap here. Black played the move king g6 here, which is a massive blunder. And Anish said in the interview after this game that he saw this coming from miles away. And guess what move he played here? Rook takes d6. He gave away the rook. And after, for example, queen takes d6, it is checkmate on f5. So obviously this is not what Richard played here. But what else can you do? Rook takes f6 is in the air, knight takes f6. There is a lot of issues all of a sudden in black's position. King g5 was played, rook d5. Anish is playing it very safely, very secure, because he knows that if he wins this game, he has potential to win the tournament. Of course, it's not that easy. He still relies on the game of Notterback, but it's already a big step to win this game. Queen e1 check was played, king g2, bishop e7, and after rook takes f5 check, king h4, and after queen g3, this is the moment that Richard resigned. The queens are being traded off, and the game looks pretty hopeless. Of course, Anish could have played a move like knight g3 to try to go for checkmate, but there's no need to complicate things so much. He knows that after queen g3, it is absolutely winning, and yeah, of course, this is looking devastating for black. So with this win, Anish jumps to 8.5 points out of 13, half a point ahead of Notterback. Notterback needs to at least not lose in order to still remain the leader in the tournament. If Notterback draws, there will be a tiebreak between Anish and Notterback. If Notterback wins, he wins the tournament. So let's take a look at Notterback's game. Notterback is facing Jurriaan van Foreest in the final round. Jurriaan could make the difference here for Anish. Is he able to beat Notterback in this very important game? Let's see what happened. The game started with e4, c5. Jurriaan starts with the Sicilian, which is a very interesting choice of opening. He is taking it very seriously. He's going for aggressive opening, and he's basically making a statement with this move, implying that he is not going to take a short draw here. He is in here for a great game. Knight f3, e6. Here you can still go to many different Sicilians, but after d4 takes knight c6, we're now in the Taimanov. Knight c3, queen c7. There's many different lines here to be played, but Notterback went for the move bishop e3, very standard. And after a6, the pretty popular these days move queen f3. And this looks a little bit odd because what is the queen actually doing there? You don't really develop your queen that quickly in the opening, and typically we see in Sicilians the queen going to the square d2, but here it's on f3. And here we see why. After h5, so typically white goes for the move queen g3 here to trade off the queens. And for example, after queen g3 takes, this rook will have an open file attacking this pawn on h5, which can be a little bit unpleasant for black. So for that reason, queen g3 is a very typical move in this line, but Notterback went for the move long castle, which is also very possible. After b5, Notterback went still for queen g3, and after takes, bishop c5 was played. Here, Notterback went for g4, of course, making use of the fact that this pawn on h5 is pinned. So bishop b7 was played, completely ignoring the fact that there is a free pawn on h5, but in the case white would capture, there's a move knight f6, and it is unclear how long this pawn will actually survive on h5. If you play h6, I mean, this pawn is not really going anywhere. So instead, Notterback played the move f3, g6 was played, and yeah, the pawn structure looks pretty odd if you look at it this way. And here, knight f5, as if nothing is happening here. There are no pawns on e6 and g6 whatsoever. But the reason why knight f5 is simply more than fine is because this bishop is attacking that bishop, and after bishop takes e3, which is also what happened in the game, knight takes e3 would be played, which also happened, by the way, and everything is fine. In case black would capture the knight, for example, e takes f5, which is a horrible move, bishop takes c5, and all the dark squares around the king are extremely weak, and knight will enter on d5, and the pawns over here are really really awful. So that's why, of course, bishop takes e3 was played, knight takes king e7. Bishop e2, simply developing the bishop, and now g5, shutting down the king side pretty much, and possibly preparing a move like g4 instead. So you're still targeting that pawn, and at the same time, g5 is restricting this knight on g8 from developing. f6 was played, f4, simply reinforcing this pawn on g5, which was captured, takes, knight e5, rook d4, and Norderbeck is focusing on the d file over here, and now Jurriaan played the move h4, which is apparently not a great move. This gave Norderbeck some chances here to make the best out of the position and play moves like a4, knight g4 to attack that knight on e5. And a4 is also attacking the pawn on b5. So there's a lot of moves available here for Norderbeck, and he went for the move knight g4. Knight c6 was played, rook 4 d2, rook h5, and now this pawn on g5 is in danger. How do you actually defend this? It's hard to see. Norderbeck goes for the resourceful move e5, and after d5, knight e4, as if nothing is happening here. What is interesting in this position is that you may think that the pawn on d5 is not pinned at all, because this knight over here is covering that rook as well as the king, so this rook has enough protection, right? But the problem is after d takes e4, rook takes d8, knight takes d8, there is this crazy move, knight f6, which is threatening to capture that rook with the bishop and the knight, and also, of course, knight takes g8 is hanging, and on top of that, rook d7 is also a threat. So everything is under attack pretty much in black's position. If you take it with the knight, you can take with the pawn on f6, and there is still bishop takes h5 hanging, and once you capture that rook, because, well, the king has to move because it's in check, those pawns over here will march forward, and that will be the end of black here. So that's why knight e4 is such a strong move played by Norderbeck. And yeah, you cannot capture it. After bishop c8, knight f6, rook h8, defending that knight, and obviously finding the only square available for that rook. Knight takes g8, Norderbeck captured the knight, which may not have been the most ideal move, because this knight on g8 was not going anywhere. You don't want to capture the knight on f6 anyways, because that allows the pawns to reconnect and causing a lot of trouble potentially for black. Norderbeck took anyways, knight f6, there's a new knight on this very strong square, but here, slowly but surely, the problems arise in Norderbeck's position all of a sudden. Look at those pawns. They're so weak, and at the same time, the only weakness in black's position is the pawn on g6. One can argue that the pawn on h4 is also weak, but it's hard to see how he can actually attack this one. Rook e1 was played, h3. Apparently, Jurriaan made a huge mistake here by playing h3. There was a possibility of making a better move, which would give him a huge advantage. After the move h3, the pawn on e5 was simply hanging. And the reason why Jurriaan didn't play this is maybe because he was afraid of bishop takes b5, which would allow the rook to capture that knight, and it doesn't really look so clear with the king in the center, so it makes sense that he didn't want to do this just yet and go for h3 first. So g takes, rook takes h3 was played, and here bishop g4, rook h4, b3, rook h8, king b2, and slowly but surely there are some pieces being traded here, but when you take a moment for this position, it looks very difficult for white to do anything here, and the sole reason is because of the fact that this rook is taking over the one file that is open, the h file. And if it was the other way around, if white's rook would have been on the h file, it would have been a completely different situation. But not only is the rook not able to go to the h file, even if it was able to go there, this knight is attacking the pawn on e5, which is also causing lots of problems for white. a3 was played, bishop a6, rook e1, b4, a4, knight d8, and here Norderbeck trades off the bishops, and it is super hard to see how he can do anything in his position. The knight is stuck on f6. It can move around, but where do you even place your knight? Meanwhile, Jurriaan's knight is heading to f7, threatening to capture one of the pawns over here, and what can Norderbeck possibly do? Knight f7 was played, c3, b takes c3, king takes c3, knight takes g5, b4, rook h3, and there comes the rook. And it's so hard to see how Norderbeck can even save this game, even try to make a draw, because his pawns are falling apart. King b2, pawn takes. There goes another pawn. Rook c2, knight f3, knight g4, knight d4, rook c8, rook b3 check. And yeah, of course, Norderbeck is still trying to find a way to make repetition, but Jurriaan is super resourceful, plays rook a3 check, takes another pawn, and after knight f6, b3, this is the moment that Norderbeck resigned. What an insane finish of the tournament, because with this loss, this means that Anish Giri is the winner of the Tata Steel Chess Tournament. Who would have thought that this would happen in the very final round? I mean, Anish Giri has had a great tournament, but Norderbeck had an even greater tournament, being the leader for so long. But unfortunately, in the last round, Jurriaan was too strong for him, and Jurriaan has made a huge comeback in the last half of the tournament. So huge congrats to Jurriaan for this game, but obviously huge congratulations for Anish Giri for winning the tournament after so many years, so many tiebreaks. He is now the sole leader in the tournament, and that's it. He doesn't even need to play tiebreaks anymore. On that note, we're going to take a look at one more game between Arjen Erigaisi and Magnus Carlsen. We all know that Magnus Carlsen didn't really have a great first half of the tournament, but in the second half, he made the comeback of the century. Let's see what he did in this game. So Arjen started with the move knight f3, knight f6, g3, b6, so both players are doing their bishops. Bishop goes to g2 and bishop to b7. And there we go. Short castle, g6, c4. Bishop g7 is all very standard opening moves. d4, short castle. d5. This is a rather surprising move because typically you don't want to push your pawns ahead that much. But Magnus hasn't really played in the center. He only focused on the sides of the board, not really in the center. Knight a6. Knight c3, and here we can see that this pawn is restricting quite a bit of the mobility of black's pieces. So this knight had to maneuver to a6 and is heading to c5 at the right time, which is apparently now. Knight d4, e5 is played, and well, here Arjen had the possibility of taking en passant, and you might think that en passant is Foreest, but Arjen disagrees and plays knight c2. I mean, it makes sense that he didn't take because he would lose the center pawn, and this would give Magnus a lot of chances to get an advantage here. So a5 was played after knight c2, b3, d6, e4 now, and the bishop is maneuvering to a different diagonal because on this diagonal the bishop isn't really doing much anymore. This pawn chain is so strong and it's hard to see what the bishop could possibly do against this. Knight a3 is played, knight e8, so black is preparing this pawn push of f5, knight a b5 was played, bishop d7, rook b1. So one of the ideas here in white's position is to go for a3, b4. You want to play b4 as soon as possible, but you do have to be a little bit careful that you don't rush it, because if you play b4 right here without playing a3, then of course a takes b4 and you will have left a pawn behind on a2, which will be a huge target. So of course you want to play a3 and then b4. f5 was played, here f3 to simply defend this pawn on e4. f4 was played, and now there comes a3. Magnus is focusing on the king side, and Arjen is focusing on the queen side. Knight b7, g4 is played to shut down the king side. h5 was played, h3, rook f7, king f2, bishop f8, rook g1. So here, Arjen is trying to defend as much as possible, of course, but Magnus is setting up an attack here. Rook h7, there goes the rook on the h-file. So after a capture on g4, this rook may have access towards the king. Bishop f1, knight f6, king e1, queen c8. Now there's 4 pieces looking at this pawn on g4. Of course, it is very well protected, but it looks pretty scary. Rook b2, knight d8, the knight is maneuvering around, knight f7, king d1, bishop e7, takes, 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 takes. It's so funny how in those moves, in the last 2 moves, Magnus opened the files for both of his rooks. You don't really see that happen so quickly and easily. Rook a1, there comes the first rook, rook b1. Rook h2, there comes the second rook. Rook g2, takes. Okay, both rooks are gone now. Pretty anticlimactic. Knight takes g4. He sacrifices the knight because he knows, look at those pawns. They're going to advance and they're really scary. Even if the king got all the way to the queen side. F takes g4, bishop takes g4, bishop f3. There we go, and bishop h3, and look how scary those pawns are gonna get. Bishop h5, g4. There they go. Knight e2, bishop f1, pins the knight on e2, very annoying. Queen d1, bishop g2, bishop g6. Magnus is playing very precise here. Knight g5, knight bc3, bishop f3, queen f1. Magnus is not rushing it with those pawns. If you move those pawns too quickly, you're weakening some squares and you're making it possibly easier for your opponent to defend. King g7, bishop f5, queen h8. And here Arjun felt the need to take on f4, which makes a lot of sense considering the fact that those pawns are getting really scary, and with the queen coming in here, it looked very dangerous. So now the bishop is on f4, covering that square on h2. So yeah, this definitely looks like Arjun still has some chances to equalize here. Bishop f6 was played, queen c1, attacking that knight on g5. Knight f7, knight b5. There's still some hope here for Arjun, of course. He's attacking the pawn on c7, so gotta be careful there. Queen a8. Magnus is absolutely ignoring this. e5 was played, trying to break through here in the center and, create some opportunities. And of course, queen a1 was a threat, a really annoying one. So like this, you're also stopping that from happening. D takes e5 was played, bishop d2, knight d6, bishop h6. Arjun gives a check here. Now knight takes d6, bishop g5, tries to trade off that bishop because of course if you take, then there might be some issues here on the king side. This king is pretty lonely over there, so that doesn't look like a great deal for black. Queen h8, bishop e3, e4. There comes another pawn, and it is shutting down this bishop on f5. It almost feels like this bishop is trapped. It does still have access to the square e6, but it's still pretty dangerous. Bishop takes b6. Arjun takes a pawn on the queen side, so he could potentially, push some pawns over there. Queen h2 is played, bishop g1, queen e2, b5, and here after queen d3 check, it was enough for Arjun. All of a sudden, it is game over because this king doesn't really have many squares available. The bishop is coming in, and it is really hard to see how white can defend himself because of those two very strong bishops. And with this win, Magnus finishes shared seconds together with Notterback. After having a tough time in the first half of the tournament, he made the comeback of the century in the second half and still manages to finish in the top 3. He was this close to win the tournament once again, but this time, Anish Giri won the tournament. Congratulations once again to Anish Giri for winning the tournament after so many years. And on that note, this is also the end of today's recap. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the recaps that I did on this tournament. It was a blast covering the games of this tournament because, it's in the Netherlands, it's close to me, and this tournament is really close to my heart as well. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.